New York doesn't know it yet, but it's about to feel different. Somewhere between the subway crowds of Flushing Meadows and the practice courts, where a young woman from Quezon City will start hitting balls under the August sun, Alex Eala has already done something no Filipino has ever done in the history of the WTA Tour. She's won a title, she's cracked the top 20, she's beaten four-time Grand Slam champions and Wimbledon finalists in the same summer. But New York isn't Washington, and it isn't Toronto either, even though both of those cities already gave her a preview of what's coming. To understand why this moment carries so much weight, you have to go back to where this all started, because Alex Eala's rise wasn't sudden in the way headlines sometimes make it look. She grew up in Quezon City, in the Philippines, in a country where tennis has never occupied anywhere near the cultural space that basketball or boxing does. Ask most casual sports fans in the Philippines to name a tennis star before this year, and the silence would have told you everything about how far this sport had to travel to be noticed. Eala's talent, though, was obvious early, and it was serious enough that her family made the decision most promising young players eventually have to make: send her abroad for elite training. She moved to Spain, into the demanding, disciplined environment that has produced so many of the sport's biggest names, trading the familiarity of home for the grinding repetition that turns raw talent into something tournament-ready. That investment started paying dividends publicly in 2022, when she broke through at the US Open Juniors, a result that put her name on the radar of anyone paying close attention to the sport's next generation. From there, her rise through the professional ranks wasn't instant, but it was steady. The kind of climb built on qualifying rounds, ranking points accumulated tournament by tournament, and the unglamorous grind that happens far away from primetime television coverage. By 2025, that patience started to show real returns, with a breakthrough run at the Miami Open and continued progress deep into Grand Slam draws, results that started making people within tennis circles talk about her as more than just a promising junior. Even before she won her first WTA singles title, she was already becoming something larger than a ranking number back home. A symbol, proof that a Filipino could compete and eventually win at the highest levels of a sport the country had never fully embraced. But everything changed, decisively and unmistakably, in Washington. Washington is where the story stopped being a promising subplot and became the headline. Eala walked into the Mubadala DC Open facing a murderer's row of a draw, and rather than being overwhelmed by it, she systematically dismantled it. She beat Chin Wen-jung in a tight three-setter to open her campaign. She then knocked out Leylah Fernandez, the tournament's defending champion, denying her a repeat before it could even get started. From there, she faced Alina Svitolina, the number 2 seed, and beat her too, setting up a semi-final against a four-time Grand Slam champion, Naomi Osaka, a name that alone would have been the biggest win of most young players' careers. Eala won that match as well, punching her ticket into the final against Jessica Pegula, the world number 3 and one of the most consistent players on the entire tour that season. The final itself turned into pure theater. A 3-hour thunderstorm delay pushed the start of the match back before a ball was even struck. And once play finally began, Pegula took control immediately, winning the first set 6-4 and grabbing an early lead in the second before rain forced the match to be suspended entirely overnight, leaving Eala trailing and the whole tournament hanging unresolved until Monday. When play resumed, something shifted. Eala found another gear entirely, fighting back to win the second set 6-4, and then completely overwhelming Pegula in the third, closing it out 6-0. Winning 10 of the final 13 games of the match. The final score read 4-6, 6-4, 6-0. Eala's first WTA singles title, her 7th top 10 win of the season, and the moment that pushed her ranking to a new career high of world number 20, officially the highest ranking any Filipino has ever reached on the WTA Tour. And even in that moment, something else was already becoming visible, something that would matter enormously for everything still to come. Pegula herself, in the aftermath of that final, publicly acknowledged just how loud and present the Filipino support inside that stadium had been throughout the tournament. The crowd wasn't just watching, it was participating. And that's exactly where the story headed into New York starts to get complicated. New York is simply not Washington, and pretending the two experiences will feel similar for Eala would be a mistake. Washington is a WTA 500 event, significant, competitive, but still a tier below what's coming. The US Open is a Grand Slam, one of only 4 tournaments in the entire year that carries that level of history, prize money, ranking points, and global media attention. The crowds at a Grand Slam are exponentially larger than anything a regular tour event produces. The media contingent multiplies many times over, with credentialed outlets from around the world parked courtside, waiting for storylines exactly like this one. The pressure that comes from playing on that stage is categorically different from anything she's experienced so far in her career, even accounting for how remarkable her summer has already been. And layered on top of all of that structural intensity is something Washington and Toronto already previewed, but New York will amplify dramatically: the emotional weight of an entire diaspora community treating her matches as something closer to a homecoming than a simple sporting event. There's a real difference between playing tennis for yourself, chasing your own dream one match at a time, and stepping onto a court knowing that an entire community has started to see your results as their results, your struggles as their struggles, your victories as evidence of something larger than one person's career. The bigger Eala becomes as a story, the heavier the expectations riding on every single point she plays are likely to feel, whether she consciously invites that weight or not. That emotional dimension isn't speculation. It's already been documented vividly in the 2 tournaments that came before this one. In Toronto, at the Canadian Open, Filipino fans turned out in numbers strong enough that Eala herself described the atmosphere afterward in unmistakably personal terms, saying the support gave her so much joy and left her feeling completely at home, despite being in a foreign country playing in a foreign stadium. Photographs and videos from that event showed exactly what that support looked like in practice. Flags draped over railings, families who had clearly made the trip together, groups breaking into chants during changeovers, young Filipino kids watching a woman who looked like them and sounded like them, competing against some of the best players in the world. Eala herself, reflecting afterward on what that Canadian Open run meant, called it a huge milestone for Philippine tennis and said explicitly that she saw it as a big deal for Filipina tennis players broadly, not just for her individual career. That's a meaningful detail because it shows she's already consciously framing her own success as something bigger than personal achievement, which makes the emotional stakes of every subsequent tournament, including this one in New York, correspondingly higher. But that same reporting out of Toronto also surfaced something worth sitting with honestly. Alongside all the joy and connection, there was also a genuine debate about crowd etiquette, with some fans publicly expressing embarrassment over how excitable and disruptive parts of the crowd became during her matches. Loud enough during play that it raised real questions about respect toward her opponents. That tension matters because it reveals something crucial about what this kind of passionate, community-driven support actually is. It's a double-edged emotional force. Support like that can genuinely lift a player, giving her energy and belief in tight moments when doubt might otherwise creep in. But that same intensity can just as easily tip into something heavier, something closer to pressure. Because when thousands of people are audibly, visibly invested in your outcome, a loss doesn't just feel like a private disappointment anymore. It starts to feel like letting people down, and that's an entirely different psychological weight to carry onto a tennis court than simply wanting to win for yourself. This is exactly where the part of the story nobody talks about enough starts to surface. The pressure that exists behind the scenes, separate from the crowd noise and the flags and the celebratory framing, the kind of pressure that comes purely from having already succeeded. Before Washington, Eala was competing with a kind of freedom that only comes from being somewhat unknown, from opponents not yet having built detailed scouting reports specifically designed around neutralizing her game. That freedom is largely gone now. Every player she faces from this point forward, especially at a Grand Slam where preparation time and coaching resources are at their absolute peak, will walk onto the court against her having studied exactly how she beat Jung, Fernandez, Svitolina, Osaka, and Pegula, looking specifically for whatever patterns and tendencies made those wins possible so they can be shut down before they start. Media attention has scaled up accordingly too, and not just from Philippine outlets covering a homegrown hero. International tennis press now treats her as a legitimate contender worth writing about in every draw preview, every seeding discussion, every projected path to the later rounds. Back home, expectations have shifted in a way that's completely understandable, but also genuinely difficult to carry. After Washington, every win she produces gets treated as confirmation of a rising star, and every loss risks becoming not just a tennis result, but a national conversation, dissected and debated far beyond what a single second-round exit would normally generate for almost any other player on tour. There's a specific danger buried inside all of that enthusiasm, one that's easy to overlook in the excitement of a breakthrough summer. People start expecting another miracle immediately, as if one extraordinary title run guarantees the next one will follow just as easily. It doesn't. Winning a WTA 500 title against a difficult draw is an enormous achievement, but it doesn't automatically transfer into deep Grand Slam runs. And the challenge of maintaining that same level of tennis, while the entire tennis world is suddenly watching closely, is a completely different test than the one she just passed. The hardest thing after making history, in almost any sport, isn't making it in the first place. It's proving that the history wasn't a one-time event, that it was the beginning of something sustained, rather than a peak she happened to catch on one unusually good week. Which brings the story back, necessarily, to the tennis itself, because none of the emotional weight, the crowd support, or the narrative significance changes what actually happens once the umpire calls the score and play begins. Eala's game has real, identifiable strengths that explain exactly how she was able to run through that Washington draw. She plays with genuine baseline aggression, willing to take the ball early and dictate rallies rather than simply survive them. She's shown real ability to absorb pace from bigger hitters and redirect it back with accuracy, a skill that matters enormously against a tour full of players who generate serious power off both wings. Her confidence against elite opponents is no longer theoretical. She has actual results now, real winning scorelines against a four-time major champion and multiple top 10 players, results that can't be dismissed as small sample flukes given how many of them she's already produced in a single season. But precisely because those results exist now, the way opponents approach playing her has changed permanently. A player entering a match against a world number 20 with a title and a string of top to 10 scalps prepares completely differently than a player facing someone still finding her footing near the fringes of the rankings. Beyond the tactical adjustments opponents will make, there's also the sheer physical toll of a Grand Slam to consider. Best of 3-set matches that can stretch into grueling battles, oppressive late August heat in New York that tests conditioning as much as skill, roaring crowd noise that can either lift a player or rattle her depending on how she's able to process it in real time. And the simple accumulated pressure of Grand Slam tennis, which sits in a different category entirely from any regular tour event, regardless of how prestigious that event might be. Facing a battle-tested, experienced opponent in an early round before she's had a chance to settle into the rhythm of the tournament carries real danger precisely because her new ranking and profile mean tougher-seeded players are now realistically positioned to cross her path sooner rather than later. All of which points to one unavoidable truth sitting underneath every ounce of Filipino pride and crowd energy that will fill whatever court she plays on. That support cannot serve a single ace for her, cannot chase down a single defensive lob, cannot save a single break point. Every serve, every return, every decision under pressure still belongs entirely to her, alone, exactly the way it always has. Zooming out from any single match result, though, reveals a bigger story that's already unfolding regardless of how deep her US Open run ends up going. Eala's success this year is doing something for Philippine tennis that extends well beyond her own career trajectory. Young Filipino girls now have a concrete answer to the question of whether it's actually possible to reach the top of a sport that's never historically welcomed players from their country into its highest levels. That kind of visible proof tends to matter enormously for participation numbers over time, for how parents think about investing in coaching and facilities for their own children, for how seriously tennis gets taken as a viable path rather than a niche hobby competing against basketball courts on every corner. Reports coming out of the Philippines this year have already pointed to a genuine uptick in interest in the sport directly tied to her rise, the kind of ripple effect that, if it continues, could meaningfully reshape investment in tennis infrastructure and coaching pathways for an entire generation of young players who are watching her results far more closely than any previous generation of Filipino athletes ever watched a tennis player before. That's the part of this story that outlasts any single tournament outcome. Whatever happens at Flushing Meadows this year, Eala has already changed what feels possible for the sport in her home country, and every match she plays from here forward, win or lose, carries a piece of that larger meaning layered on top of the simple scoreboard. So as the tournament approaches, all of these threads start pulling together into a single, unresolved question. A historic WTA title. A career-high ranking inside the top 20. A wave of Filipino fans already primed to turn her matches into something resembling a home crowd, thousands of miles from home. the unmatched pressure and scale of a grand slam. Opponents who now scout her as a genuine threat rather than an unknown floater in the draw. A bigger stage than she's ever played on, carrying more weight than any tournament she's competed in before. The honest question isn't whether she'll show up and play. She will, because that much is certain. The real question is whether New York becomes simply another Grand Slam appearance on an already remarkable resume, or whether it becomes another moment that permanently reshapes how Filipino tennis is viewed, the way Washington already did in miniature. Nobody watching this unfold, however confident they feel in either direction, should pretend to know the answer in advance. The uncertainty itself is the point. This isn't a story that promises a win, and it shouldn't pretend to. For Eala, that gap is going to contain more than it would for almost any other player in the draw. It's going to contain Quezon City, and the version of her that first picked up a racket long before anyone outside her family had any idea what she'd eventually become. It's going to contain Spain, and years of unglamorous, repetitive training far from home, the kind of daily grind nobody ever puts on a highlight reel. It's going to contain that 3-hour rain delay in Washington, and the version of her that was down a set and adrift in the second, before finding whatever it took to win 10 of the final 13 games, and become, officially, the highest-ranked Filipino in WTA history. It's going to contain Toronto too, and the specific memory of hearing her own name chanted by people who'd clearly traveled, organized, planned entire trips around being there for her, telling her afterward how loved and how at home she felt despite being nowhere near actual home. All of that history doesn't stay backstage during a match. It walks out onto the court with her, whether she wants it to or not. And then there's the part of that gap that has nothing to do with her personal history at all, the part that belongs entirely to everyone else in that stadium. Picture specifically what that crowd looks like, because it's not an abstraction. It's families who bought flights and hotel rooms specifically around her match schedule, treating a second-round tennis match the way some families might treat a milestone wedding, something worth the expense and the travel because of what it represents. It's Filipino-American parents who never had a tennis star to point to growing up, now sitting next to their own kids, pointing at a screen or a scoreboard and saying, effectively, look what's possible. It's people who will never meet Eala, who have no personal connection to her beyond a shared flag and a shared language, who will nonetheless feel her results in their chest the way people feel things that are personal even when they're not. That's an enormous amount of meaning to compress into the few seconds before a chair umpire says, "Quiet, please," and calls the score. And here's the part of this that's worth being completely honest about, rather than romanticizing. None of that meaning, however real and however moving, changes the physics of what happens next. A serve either lands in or it doesn't. A ball either clears the net or it catches it. Eala's opponent, whoever she is on a given day, doesn't care about any of this history, doesn't factor in flags or chants or how many people flew in from Toronto or Jersey City or Los Angeles to be there. Her opponent cares about backhand depth, about second serve placement, about whether Eala's movement holds up in the third set of a long, humid afternoon in Flushing. The moment the umpire calls the score, the stadium's meaning gets set aside, almost violently, in favor of something much narrower and much more mechanical. 2 players, 1 ball, a series of decisions that have to get made correctly, point after point, regardless of what's happening in the stands. This is the tension that actually defines what's coming, more than any prediction about wins or losses ever could. The crowd's presence is real, and its effect on her is real too. Professional athletes across every sport have talked for decades about the tangible lift that comes from feeling supported rather than isolated in a hostile away environment, the way energy in a stadium can genuinely translate into an extra half-step of urgency on a crucial point. But that same crowd, precisely because its investment is so genuine, creates a psychological weight that has nothing to do with her forehand or her serve percentage. When you know that thousands of people organized their week, their travel, their emotional energy around watching you specifically, a loss isn't just a private disappointment anymore. It becomes something you have to actively separate from what it means about you as a person, as a symbol, as a representative. Separate it fast enough and firmly enough that it doesn't bleed into the next point, the next game, the next set. That's not a skill anyone teaches in a standard coaching manual. It's something players either learn to manage through experience or they don't, and New York, at this scale, with this much riding on it emotionally, is a genuinely new kind of test for her specifically. So when the moment finally arrives, and it will, sooner rather than later, nobody watching should expect some kind of guaranteed storybook outcome, just because the emotional stakes are high enough to deserve one. Sports doesn't work on narrative fairness. New York doesn't owe her an easy draw, or a forgiving bounce, or a crowd loud enough to overcome a legitimately better day from whoever's standing across the net. What the crowd can offer instead is something quieter, and in its own way, more durable than a single result. Proof, regardless of the scoreline that eventually gets posted, that this stopped being just her story a while ago, and became something an entire community decided to carry alongside her, match by match, point by point, for as long as this remarkable season keeps going.